to welcome Nancy Proctor to the New Media Seminar. Nancy's quite familiar with the BGC. She's graciously came and worked with Timoni and I on projects with our Artifact in the Age of New Media class, I think 2 years ago, helping our students design apps. And it was really an incredibly worthwhile experience for all of us. Nancy's the Deputy Director for Digital Experience and Communication at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She also co-chairs the Museums and the Web meeting. And previously she headed up mobile strategies and initiatives at the Smithsonian, and also new media initiatives before that at the Smithsonian's American Art Museum. She has a PhD in American art history and a background in film curation and art criticism. And there's more. She's managed a museum on mobile.info, which my students look to for very smart, thoughtful things during their researches. She is a digital co-editor and curator at the Museum Journal. She's co-founded thegallerychannel.com. And also today, we are going to talk with Nancy, and I think she would like a conversation, if we can manage this, about going universal. So thank you very much. Welcome, Nancy Proctor.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning Museum Mobile. It's a wiki that we started up many years ago, and to be honest, it's in need of some updating in TLC. So if anybody's interested in a wiki project, talk to me afterwards. Okay, so yeah, today I'm gonna try to use this wonderful equipment you all have and talk a little bit about going universal and a number of different meanings of that phrase. This image here is of the Kogod Courtyard, which covers the central courtyard that is shared by the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And it has been a metaphor for me for about 7 or 8 years now. So one of the themes that I'll kind of keep touching on throughout this talk is how it represents a sort of a structure or an approach to the museum as platform and as presence in the world. I initially used this to talk about the museum as a distributed platform. I'll come back to that as well. It might be a phrase you've heard elsewhere. And just spoiler alert, where we're going is to talking about the ubiquitous or the pervasive museum. And in both senses of distributed and pervasive, I do really mean the technological kind of sense of those terms, in the sense of computing in a networked way. But before we get too techy, I wanted to spend some time just enjoying some content. This is a fabulous, it's actually an advertisement for Thai Life. And what I love about it is that it has been verbally described by J.J. Hunt. He is a Canadian verbal describer whose work was introduced to me by Sina Baram. That's another name you're going to be hearing a lot during this talk. And I'll be trying to channel him at various moments. Sina is an accessibility consultant, a technologist, and just kind of an all-around guru and brilliant thinker in our field. So he considers J.J. Hunt his favorite verbal describer. Sina is, by the way, completely blind. So he is something of a connoisseur of verbal description. And so I'm going to try to play this for you. Now, if you want to play a game with me, and I did check in with Sina about this before proposing it. There's obviously, is there anybody in this room who is blind or partially sighted? Just closing your eyes is obviously not going to give you the sense of what it feels like to be blind or to be partially sighted. But if you would like, you could close your eyes and listen to this really as an exercise in empathy, a different way of experiencing content, or if you just want to watch, it's also a visually very beautiful thing to watch. So let's see now. I can drive this mouse.
อะไรถ้าเขาทำแบบนี้
Oh. Excuse me, I'm going to have to stop that because somehow I've ended up with the Thai version as opposed to the English version. Let's see if I can get. I can't see my mouse. Use pause.
Does it matter?
Yes, because the English version is voiced over in English. I mean, unless you speak Thai. So, let's see. I think I should be able to switch language up here. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go up to the front. Apologies for the delay. I haven't actually ever come to the Thai version before, so I don't know how I managed to do that.
Walking down the sidewalk, a young Thai man gets soaked by a gutter spout.
It's not playing the English. Let me try this one more time from here.
Walking down the sidewalk, a young Thai...
I think full screen. Somebody's, what are you saying?
Just doesn't like full screen.
Ah, maybe that is it. Okay. All right, let me take it off full screen then.
Walking down the sidewalk, a young Thai man gets soaked by a gutter spout. Stepping aside, he moves a scraggly potted plant into the flow of water. When a woman struggles to hoist her vending cart onto the sidewalk, the man helps her push it over the curb. A stray dog finds the man eating at a stall and is rewarded with a piece of chicken. The cook shakes his head. When the man finds a woman and her daughter begging on the street behind a sign that reads, "For education," he gives the little girl some money. Looking on, a store owner shakes his head. Later, the man quietly hangs some bananas off an old woman's doorknob. What does he get in return for doing this every day? Later, he finds the potted plant receiving more water. Nearby, the vendor grumbles at the curb. "There you are," she says when the man approaches to help. The stray dog begs for more food, and the man gives him 2 chicken legs. He offers the little girl all the money in his wallet, and the store owner shakes his head again. The little girl bows her head in thanks. On a bus, the man offers a woman his seat, while at home, the old woman finds the bananas on her doorknob.
เขาจะไม่ได้อะไรเลย
He gets nothing. He won't be richer, won't appear on TV, still anonymous, and no bit more famous. He playfully helps the vendor with her cart. The man pets the stray dog goodbye, but when he leaves, the dog follows him. Down the street, the man opens his wallet, but finds the mother on the sidewalk without the little girl beside her. "Mom!" The man turns to see the little girl running toward him, dressed in a new school uniform. She stops and grins, and a smile washes over the man's face. The store owner looks on, stunned. What he does receive are emotions. The man shares a laugh with the vendor and feeds the hungry dog. He witnesses happiness, reaches a deeper understanding, feels the love. He prays in his humble bedroom. Holding the bananas, the old woman gives him a hug. Receives what money can't buy, a world made more beautiful. On the sidewalk, flowers bloom on the potted plant. The girl counts with her mother, and the vendor gives a customer a little bit extra. And in your life, what is it that you desire most? The man sits with the dog at a flower. Thai Life Insurance. Believe in good. www.thaigoodstories.com.
I assure you I'm not in the pay of Thai Life, but thank you for bearing with me through the multiple iterations of that technical thing. All right, now I gotta get back to keynote here. Sorry, these are there. Is that it? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So that is, I think, a really superior example of verbal. Yeah. What was your experience of it?
I've seen it before.
Okay.
A while ago, so I was just trying, flashes of it were coming back to me, but I was also trying to remember the images that I'd seen. So I was placing the movie. I was creating the movie in my mind, basically. Just filling it in visually.
And as somebody who works with film, I'm sure that comes naturally to you. Yeah. Did anybody else have any particular experiences of it?
It was kind of disorienting that the subtitles, the text that was on the actual screen was spoken in the same exact manner as the narration. So I don't know how somebody who is only listening would be able to tell, or would that really matter?
Right. Yeah. Good question. That would be a good question to ask somebody who's in that situation. Yeah. I mean, obviously, one of the things they're trying to do is make sure that there is the visual subtitle. So if you're deaf, for example, or for some other reason can't hear it, you can still get the information.
The poignancy of it, though, seems to be so much prompted by the images more than just the storyline. I hear it, the tone of voice signals or an emotional response more than, say, a completely neutral narration would be. But it's an interesting challenge to try to describe to somebody why something looks emotionally compelling, but using very straight descriptive language.
Yeah.
It's a tricky translation
It's a very
process.
delicate balance, and this is exactly a point that some colleagues and I are thinking about a lot right now. So I'll go on to talk about working with crowdsourcing verbal descriptions. Professional verbal describers work very hard not to interpret, really just to describe. So they're putting themselves almost like a translator in a position of mediation in between the content and the audience, but not trying to interject anything new necessarily. And there, as you can imagine, that's a very subjective call. Yes.
But don't you think the music, that additional layer of music is very loaded, and it tips, it's triggering an emotional response. I mean, there's something about that that I think
It's very deliberate, yeah. Thai Life wants you to cry at the end of this, right? And so it's an interesting position for the verbal describer of how much are they complicit with that, how much are they a neutral presence in that mix.
This is a commercial that was on TV.
I'm not actually sure. You said you'd seen it before. What do you know about it?
Oh, it was viral.
Yeah.
People were just sharing it around social network. I never saw it on TV though.
It's pretty long for a commercial. I don't know whether Thai television is completely different.
Right, yeah.
There are a series of Thai life insurance commercials that go online. They're pretty emotionally manipulative.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
And what does it have to do with insurance?
You remember the brand?
You're investing in your future.
Yeah. Quality, I don't know, like I said, I'm really not in their employ. I was really just interested in how this one was verbally described as a piece of, professionally described content. Yeah.
Can we just discuss it? Because
Yeah, please.
I'm interested that you think that that's neutral and somehow unmediated, that description.
Well, what I was saying is that that's the goal, as I understand it, for professional verbal describers, is to play a pretty neutral role.
But doesn't that inscribe a kind of normativity? Because I'm thinking about Amanda Baggs's video where she's in my language, where she is, the first half is her as a non-English, normative, communicative person expressing herself in her language, and then she translates that. And one could have a completely unnormative description, which is focusing on the background, or focusing on facial expressions, or focusing on dog, or you know, which could be equally neutral, but just not describing a kind of, from a non-normative perspective, what someone from a different vantage point might see. So, I mean, I'm making the connection between what you were saying about verbal description and crowdsourcing and what you might say about folksonomies or taggings or the relationship of the authoritative relationships and interpretation that come out in the digital. But I'm wondering if you could just speak more about why you think this is a good example of the neutral.
I think it's a great example of verbal description because it made me cry. I mean, that's partly the video. But no, I'm not, I agree with you, and I'm really glad that you brought this up. This is exactly the kind of thing that I wanted to kind of discuss. Is there a such thing as a neutral position? As I understand it, that is, to some extent, a goal of professional verbal describing. And it's one that, as you can imagine, is somewhat challenged by the idea of crowdsourcing verbal descriptions, where you might even say part of a crowdsourcing project, one of the aims, is to recruit as many different voices as possible. And then people could hear, the same piece of content, the same artwork, the same exhibit, described from a number of different points of view. And what then does the experience become? And there are lots of practical ramifications around that as well. I won't even go into the kind of technical issues, but if you think about a museum or other cultural visitor experience of an exhibit or an art object that is layered with multiple voices and multiple interpretations, how long are they really going to spend with that piece in that moment, in that place? At the moment, I think kind of industry standard, people spend far more time reading the object label than looking at an object in a museum, and that's, still like 7 seconds. If they're listening to an audio tour message, you might get them to stay in one place for as much as a minute, maybe a little bit more. But if we're starting to, this is when it was a long video, 3 minutes, let's say, what we wanted to describe in the museum took that long to describe, and then you want to add in different voices. How much time are people going to give it? And I don't have answers to that, and that's kind of part of why I wanted to come and speak to you all today, was to put some of these questions out there, because I think they're really interesting ones to kind of work on. Do you have any good thoughts?
Well, I'd love to hear more about the projects that you're working on.
Okay. Yes, I will. Yeah.
There's a show about to open at the New York Historical Society on the Silicon Valley of New York and how technology started in New York and Bell Labs and blah, blah, blah. And what they have done to try to make it accessible is to have many, many people interviewed, not only about the past, but also about what's going on now, to make spaces where artificial intelligence people collaborate and so on. It takes so damn long to listen to these comments. There's a whole room that has bars of talkers on different subjects, and I can't imagine anyone in their right mind that would sit there for half an hour and listen to these inane comments from people about technology's history in New York, which we kind of all know a little bit anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting that in some ways I think we're kind of trying to shoehorn new media into a 19th century museum experience, and not usually providing enough chairs and good speakers or comfortable headphones or physical means of enjoying the content. So when I think about one of the concerns about technology and digital media use in museums has always been, surely you're not trying to replicate the real world experience. You could never compete with the serendipity, the passion, the wonder of encountering the object in person. And I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. But what I am interested in is what kinds of experiences around museums, cultural heritage, etc., are actually perhaps in some ways better suited for a digital environment than that kind of walking through the gallery that's sparsely populated with chairs.
No
and,
chairs.
or none, if any. And trying to think about how do we, back to this idea of the pervasive museum, or at least the distributed museum, how do we think about the museum existing on multiple platforms, each one playing to its own strengths? So we're not trying to make you listen to hours and hours of audio commentary while you're standing on marble floors, but nonetheless making that content available in another context and moment where you might be able to actually appreciate it more.
I think the same thing is happening at the Cooper Hewitt with those pens. Half the time you use the pen when you go home, it doesn't work.
Ah, okay, well we're going to get to the pen too. So
These are just gadgets and they're stupid.
shall I move forward and we can come back to the pen? Okay, but feel free to stop me at any time. This is your seminar, so. Okay, so I won't dwell on this too much, but this video has the verbal describing that we just saw is employing some of the kind of principles, what are called the principles of universal design. Some of the ones that it touches on is perceptible information. It's communicating the necessary information effectively regardless of the user's sensory abilities. So if you can't hear, you can read the subtitles. If you can't see, you can hear, etc. It's deliberately made to be useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. It accommodates a wide range of different preferences and abilities through those different media that it uses. And, except for my little problem of making it go full screen and then losing the English language narration, it is pretty simple and intuitive to use in its presentation. I should say, actually, the site where it's described is youdescribe.org. So if you want to check out some more, do go there. It's a crowdsourcing site for verbal descriptions for film. Now there actually are 7 principles of universal design, and Sina Baram, whom I mentioned earlier, has blogged about them and in applying them to accessible and inclusive exhibits. And so I'll just run quickly through them all, and I do encourage you to go read his post later. So equitable use, so this is what we talked about just in the last slide there, aiming at being accessible and useful to people of different abilities. Flexibility, simple and intuitive use, that it's perceptible, it's visible, you can get to it. Tolerance for error, this is quite an important one because, even if you're fully ably bodied, you might in any given moment have your hands full, or what you're hearing drowned out by some loud sound. So we're looking for ability to nonetheless communicate under those conditions. Exhibits that require low physical effort. So if you either temporarily or permanently might have, say, low mobility in your hands or in your body, that does not become a barrier. And then finally, that exhibits should have the size and space necessary for people, be they in wheelchairs or with service animals, or simply just, guiding through a troop of small kids can nonetheless get up to them. So Sina uses this word inclusive in his blog post, and I think it's interesting to ask the question of what's the difference between universal and inclusive. So he kind of helped me out in talking through that. So universal design started out in the disability space as an architectural practice. So this was about ramps and elevators and things like that largely. Universal design has 7 rules or principles, so it's kind of considered a framework or guide. But he points out, universal design is a little bit like trying to boil the ocean. It kind of goes back to the point that you made about all these different voices. Actually accommodating every single one is a universal problem, or of a universal scale. Talk today. I'm going to use it to talk about things that are accessible, that are inclusive by design, and are included or available to everyone. For example, universal audio tour provision. So that's a term that when I worked for Antenna Audio in the audio tour business, we would use to refer to an audio tour of a museum exhibit that's available to everyone who comes to visit that show. So it's universal, it's handed out, included in the price of admission, or otherwise universally available to all visitors. Now, making things universally available is obviously really part of the museum's mission, that we are obliged to preserve, present, and interpret our collections for the broadest possible audience. But of course the challenge is, how do you afford that? Again, it's this challenge of scale. And I've always found Max Anderson's article on, first of all, our core assets can't be sold. Our mission, as I said earlier, mandates that we have to make those assets, our collections, our expertise, our scholarship, our events, our programs, accessible for the broadest possible audience, whether or not that audience can afford to pay for the cost of that access. And we have to do it forever. Right? If a museum gets into financial trouble, just ask the Delaware Museum of Art, what happens if you start selling assets to dig yourself out of the hole? You cannot, like a startup business, say, okay, we're going to declare bankruptcy, open up tomorrow across the street under a different name. It just doesn't work that well. If we started verbally describing them today, and could do one a minute 24/7, I think it'd take us something like 200 years to get through them all in English, by which point English will have changed and we'll have to start over anyway. Forget all the other languages that the Smithsonian's audiences speak. So it was one where really the only practical solution to the problem was crowdsourcing. We actually needed a workforce on the scale of the problem itself. So we adopted the kind of the strategy, if you will, or the mantra for our mobile program of using the pervasive, connected, social nature of mobile technologies to recruit the world to help the Smithsonian with projects that even with its $1 billion a year budget, it would never have the money, staff, and time to do itself. So is there anybody in this class who will have heard me speak before here?
I don't think so.
No? Okay, so this will be all
Makes
new.
a difference.
Because actually, students from Bard kind of gave some
we have a
feedback
mix
on
of
this.
Both students, faculty,
Okay.
people from outside the institution,
Okay.
alumni.
Well, at least this will be new to you. Look at that lovely volume image on there. On my screen grab. So what I'm showing you here are screens from older projects that kind of were the response, or inspired the response to this challenge posed by Beth Zebarth from the Smithsonian. Around the time that she asked that question, I met an artist named Halsey Burgund. He's based in the Boston area, and he had just created a wonderful mobile app experience as an art installation at the DeCordova Sculpture Park, and it's an app called Scapes, and it doesn't normally have a volume button on the screen like that. That was a hastily made screen grab, I'm afraid. The project is deinstalled, so you can't experience it live anymore, but you can still access the app. And essentially, it was a crowdsourced audio soundtrack for the DeCordova Sculpture Park. The app does two very simple things. It allows you to listen to what people have said as they've walked around the park, with that content geolocated, tagged to the place where the person recorded it. Or you can do your own recordings. And they're kind of played back in this continuous stream. And it's a very, very beautiful experience. So I approached Halsey about working with us on crowds, how that's going forward. That project is being led by the Peabody Essex Museum, but has many, many other museums participating. Meanwhile, over at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Susan Chun, along with Sina Baram, Anna Chiaretta Lavatelli, and others, have been developing a web-based crowdsourcing workflow system for verbal descriptions. So it essentially allows you to crowdsource verbal descriptions both of well, really of anything that you would want in your galleries, but also of images on your website. So, for example, your online collection. And it provides, essentially a way for curators to be able to review different iterations and editors to kind of come in and track the content. And so they've been working with various groups, both in-house staff and kind of local community members, poets and others, to see what kind of content they can get from non-professional verbal describers of the collection. And what I thought I would do is, and I'm perhaps tempting fate too much tonight, but I'm going to try to play for you using voiceover on my iPhone the verbal description that was created for this photograph. This is an Ana Mendieta piece from 1978, and it's a print untitled from the Silhouette series. So this obviously you could, these are written verbal descriptions, which obviously you could have someone record, but you can also use them as text in apps, which is kind of why I want to show it to you in voiceover. So even if you don't have the recording studios or the voice talent, the content can still be available. And particularly for people who are blind, they get a lot of automated voice read text. That's a very kind of common experience.
Voiceover on. Mail. Here it is. Message. http/http. Page 3 of 7.
Okay, here we go. So this is the verbal description, one that was kind of contributed through this crowdsourcing project at the MCA.
In the photograph, you seem to stand in a small clearing sparsely populated with flattened weeds in the fore and middle grounds and with an uneven arc of wild grass 2/3 up the image. An impenetrably dark row of trees fills the horizon. The photograph is black and white and strongly lit, so that each blade of grass and clump of dirt casts an intense shadow. At your feet lies a short, crudely dug trench, whose excavated soil remains, forming a rim around it. The shallow slit, dug from bone-dry earth, lies in the middle of the image and tapers at the end nearest you. From the trench's pitch-black interior, a blast of opaque, white smoke streams out, billowing directly up and off the photograph's top edge.
Okay.
Alert. Accessibility selected.
Let me
Select
turn off
voiceover
voiceover before I make the thing blow up. So now somebody like Sina actually would listen to that at a speed that we probably wouldn't even understand. So I slowed it down quite a bit. How did that hit you as an experience, say, compared to that first video?
Well, the first video was much more emotional. This was like really uncomfortable.
I've listened to screen readers read web pages, so that experience was equally jarring, where it was like a foreign experience. You're like trying to process that voice, which is very monotone, robotic. It's kind of like keeping this awkward pace. So you're trying to follow along with it. It's very.
And you're following along, you're trying so hard to follow along with it, and you're not really processing entirely what it's saying. And I felt like it was, I've heard, similar voice, I don't know what you would call it, but I've heard things like that before, but much, much slower, and so that was so fast. It was just like, it felt really abrupt.
It also gave the image a lot more specificity. Like, I didn't realize that's what I was looking at until I heard it described. So it changed what I was seeing.
That's interesting. So that's one of what I've observed as a kind of a universal design effect of having verbal descriptions is even if you can see the work, having it verbally described to you can actually make you see it differently or see it arguably better. And it is a common technique in even just traditional audio tours that are not necessarily aimed at people who are blind or partially sighted to start by describing key elements of whatever it is that you're looking at, and it kind of opens your eyes in an interesting way.
I mean, isn't that in some ways what museum labels of some types do? They offer read verbal description that's meant to highlight your experience of the work. And
Absolutely.
If it works, it points out things that you might miss or
That's right.
sets up things that you see differently.
Yes.
And it can be an intensifier of experience.
Except that those kinds of descriptions are usually geared towards a particular interpretive framework, which could be art historical or anthropological. I'm not privileging any of those, but that description was not. I don't know what the agenda of that description was. I mean, I don't think that's what I don't see that description when I look at that image, and I wouldn't describe it in that. And the artist probably would say, you could say all sorts of other things about all sorts of things that are in my mind right now that are completely different to that description. So I don't understand why that is so deep. What the context of that, or how? I mean, if you can't see the image, that seems really problematic to me, because it seems to undermine the point of what an artwork is, which is to allow for a modality of appreciation.
I think it's the literalness of the description, which I think you can gloss as neutral. I wouldn't gloss it as neutral, but it's literal in a sense. It's what the image depicts, but is that what the artwork is? I think there's a slippage between what the image depicts and what the artwork is.
But I mean, I don't think those are weeds necessarily. Are they weeds? Is that foliage? Are there shadows? I mean, there's lots of things that I could challenge even at that level.
Some of this obviously is germane to all interpretation, right? So when curators sit around writing labels and reviewing each other's labels, these are the kinds of conversations that are happening, because you've got 50 to 250 words to make a point. Which one do you make? But it's interesting that you're picking up on exactly those same issues then carry over to any other kind of content that's being generated, even if it's, in a sense, as I was saying, theoretically, professionally, not supposed to be interpretation. Is it really possible for there not to be an interpretive effect? And then you're back into the realm of, okay, so who's speaking, why, in what context, who gets to have the voice, who gets heard right now?
I'm wondering if verbal descriptors are the only means being given to disabled situations, if haptic technologies are being developed more, or...
Oh yeah, this is just one of many, yeah. I mean, actually, I think one of the areas where new technology is developing in a most interesting and kind of innovative way is in the area of accessibility. And of course, some things are done unintentionally, I mean, things you think about like the Google cars that are driving around doing street mapping. I mean, what an incredible tool for accessibility those will be.
The difficulty, I think, is mapping like a one-to-one experience, that's not going to be possible. So visual artistic interpretation will be inherently different than a verbal description, but to try to achieve the same end result, if the author or the artist has meaning, even in those situations where the artist is trying to impart meaning onto an artistic work, that doesn't mean me as a viewer comes away with that meaning that's suggested in the work. So it seems to me almost, I won't say impossible, even though we're trying to give a similar experience, that one may never be like the other one. I don't know.
And that's the theory of translation, that the work that you create, you're creating new work, that there's not a complete there's not a complete equivalence between the two registers.
It's sort of like literalizing a work of art does not, in fact, it's not the same as the actual object.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I mean,
it's very disruptive.
And you do end up very quickly in this kind of, you thought the problem was one of a certain kind of scale, which is how do you get all the voices, all the languages, all the objects covered. And then you realize then there's also this other problem of scale, as it were, on the receiving end, who's hearing and how are they going to hear it. And I think it very quickly comes down to, okay, so what do? Do we do nothing? Do we provide no verbal descriptions, no interpretation? Do we hope that the art will, quote, speak for itself, put it in a white cube?
Well, in this case, at the very least, we should start by having the description be accurate. I mean, I think we could actually say some of what that robotic voice was saying. I would say, what?
I think, so
Where
is
is
your name
that?
Heidi?
And I didn't.
Heidi, sorry.
Yeah.
But I think part of what you were saying is, I'm not sure there is a truth, a platonic truth, true good, there is a perfect description that could be made for all people at all moments. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah, I'm finding this very provocative.
Good.
I mean, but it's making in lots of problematic ways. But I mean, one can have the artist saying, this work is about my feeling of alienation, or it's about my rape, or it's about my the place where, you know, my dispossession from my tribal lands, or, you know, talking about the image in that way might conjure up and evoke greater sensibility and a greater sense of an aesthetic connection to the image than a verbal description, maybe. And I just think there's so many things to unpack. I mean, around accessibility. So I'm interested in why have you chosen verbal description as the kind of prototype of this ideal about inclusion and accessibility?
For this talk today,
or in
for my
general,
work?
how are you
Well,
thinking?
really,
Why would you-
honestly, it did come out of this question because it was my job at the Smithsonian to try to help solve problems using mobile technologies, and I got this question, and around the same time encountered an artist, and I like very much to look at how artists are using technologies and try to learn from and be inspired by them rather than just doing it in the kind of the more typical, what would you say, commercial applications or standard applications. And one of the things which I actually won't go into today because I'm just kind of noticing the time, but one of the things that I really liked about Halsey's system, which he actually built a piece of an open source software platform called Roundware to do this, it delivers the content in a stream. So there isn't, if you go to a multimedia tour app of a kind of a typical museum tour app these days, quite often you'll find for every object there's 1 to say 3 or even more layers of information, messages about it. And one might be kind of more or less the tombstone information, one might be the artist speaking, one might be the curator speaking, one might even be a verbal description. But they're kind of hierarchized. And what I like about Halsey's apps is that there is no hierarchy, there's this constant stream, and it's actually an algorithm that chooses from a database how content plays and blends into one another. And I found that an interesting alternate interface that doesn't, I would say, solve the problems that you're raising, but it approaches them from a different angle that I felt might help us in some ways deal with this problem of scale. Please.
While you were at the Smithsonian, were you able to do evaluations for both what the user experience was and then how many people were using this?
Yes.
And then can you tell us about how many sort of, I don't know, what's the data on the apps that have been developed for museums? How are people using this new technology?
So that's kind of a whole different talk, but the short answer is yes, we have studies, and yes, we have data on that. And the use is not quite at the level that one would want, is kind of the short answer.
I worked on an app project, and we just found that for the amount of effort that went into developing it, and the just sort of thinking about scholarship and public scholarship and how much information people want, and especially on smaller devices, it seems, I would love if this had the artist's perspective in addition to the simple description. But I wonder, I just want to know how are people interacting with these things?
Yeah. I would be more than happy to have that conversation with you offline or point you to some resources because it is a very, very interesting topic. But I am going to need to make some decisions, so it's about 6 minutes to 7. What time do we need to wrap up?
Around 7:30.
Oh, okay, great,
So
excellent.
you can divide up in terms of
Yeah,
keeping this
excellent.
format or a bit more formal Q&A.
This is wonderful. I love this conversation. I just wanted to make sure, because I did want to, I promised you to get back to the pen, and I didn't want to run out of time for that. So how about I'll move on forward to that, and we can always kind of come back. And that's great news that we can go until 7:30. So, not to kind of gloss over all of the really great points that everybody was bringing up, but to nonetheless kind of move forward a little bit. What I find interesting about these kind of crowdsourcing approaches is, of course, they come straight out of kind of Web 2.0 culture and the new business models that have been made possible by the internet. What's on the screen now is just a screen grab from Arch Daily, the architecture kind of blog, covering the Guggenheim's recent Wikipedia editathon about women in architecture. And you see at the top it says bookmark this picture, which I'll come back to that in a moment. So while it's not perhaps realistic or even desirable for a museum to be run like a business because of the constraints that I mentioned earlier, I do think that it's very interesting to think about running museums like startups. That is, iteratively developing products and offerings in partnership with the people they serve. So this is kind of straight out of Lean Startup, Seth Godin, Purple Cow kind of theories of the latest generation of business practice, where you're not kind of in what's called a waterfall way, building a product, perfecting it, marketing it, advertising it, putting out there, and then seeing what the public thinks. But right from your very earliest beta or even alpha, you're out there in the field working with people, getting their feedback, tweaking it and changing it. And that's just another metaphor or framework within which to talk about, frankly, what museums' missions mandate that we do anyway, which is serve our communities. And to do that, obviously, you want to be developing your products and your services in partnership with the people who are meant to use them. So the thing that is beautiful to me about this approach and initiatives like the MCAs and the Wikipedia editathons is that, and really community-based initiatives in general, is that they're endlessly renewable and renewed by that input from the changing audiences that we serve. So it's kind of a way of not getting stuck in, if we see too much of the 19th century museum model still persists in our in-gallery experiences, how do we avoid getting stuck in a 21st century model as well? And I think this kind of way of, all the problematic parts of that notwithstanding, to really kind of embrace that challenge and work with the public is a very, very interesting way forward to my way of thinking. And along those lines of kind of business models, something else that has kind of informed my thinking for some time is the work of Chris Anderson, the editor of Wired magazine. And you might remember, again, a very old book on the long tail. And he notes that one of the things that internet technologies and internet-based businesses have brought forward is an understanding that the shape of a market has really kind of two sides. So at the left there, you see the kind of what's called the hockey stick end, the mass market. So this is, Frozen. I have a young daughter, so our whole life is about Frozen. Everything is Frozen. They sing all the songs. It's just, everybody's doing it. And then down at the long tail, niche markets. So, these are people who are into underwater basket weaving, or a very particular rare kind of stamp, or Chris Anderson uses the example of Lego robotics or whatever. They're not large markets in terms of numbers, but when you start being able to connect people who are interested in the same kind of specialist stuff from around the world, they do become powerful as a group, and actually could even, for certain kinds of businesses, be very interesting from a commercial point of view. What I find interesting for museums in this shape is that museums are all about niches. I mean, our collections are collections of niche content curated by curators with niche speciality, niche specialist knowledge. And if anybody should be able to figure out how to serve niche markets, I reckon it should be museums. So I won't pretend to have the answer to how museums can get rich on serving niche markets, but I think it's definitely a way of thinking about markets and business that is probably going to be more sustainable long-term than, for example, the Blockbuster exhibition, which really goes after the mass market. But what about that mass market? So in addition to universal design, however likely we think we are to be able to achieve that, we also need comprehensive distribution strategies to provide accessibility and to basically get our products, our interpretation, our experiences, our programs out to the public per our mission. So this actually kind of touches on the question that we had earlier about, we're building all these apps, is anybody actually using them? How do we make sure that when we've invested in developing these things that they actually get used? So how can museums move from niche appeal to mass inclusiveness is my question. So the universal business model, I mentioned earlier, for example, the universal audio tour where everyone gets one. Typically that happens because it's free or it's included in the price of admission or it's otherwise subsidized for every visitor. So if you go to Cooper Hewitt, every visitor gets a pen. That's called a universal distribution. And one of the impacts of being able to hand out one of whatever it is to everybody who comes in the door is that if that is a good product experience, it enhances the value of the visit price. So, I do not know this. I haven't had these conversations at all, but I'm pretty certain that as Cooper Hewitt was reopening, the fact that everybody was going to get a pen was considered one of the value adds for the price of admission there. It's the only Smithsonian museum that charges admission, so that's kind of a topic that's much discussed. It also, and especially in terms of things like audio tours, increases expectations or demands for translation, because if you're trying to hand something out to everybody, then you need to be able to serve them in the language and in the means that they require. And the keys, or two of the keys to take-up rate or the extent to which you are able to serve everyone are really come down to human operations as well as kind of marketing and signage. And this is true even if you're just offering, say, an optional audio tour or some optional thing that if it could be a lecture in the evening or it could be a film in your IMAX theater. If you haven't done a good job marketing and promoting it, nobody knows it's there, nobody's going to use it. So this is all kind of basic and obvious stuff, but I thought it might just be useful to have it out there on the table. So coming to Cooper Hewitt's pen, which has been such an incredibly interesting project to study, and you in this town might be sick of hearing about it, but with the Museums in the Web has a sort of a showcase site, and we did just publish just a few pages on the project, mainly links to other publications and writings about the project, as well as there's a sort of a 12,000 word essay written by Seb Chan from Cooper Hewitt. So if you do need any more information, you can certainly go there and get it. One of the reasons why I've been fascinated by it is because in some ways it's kind of rediscovered and reaffirmed a lot of the best practices that have been understood in the audio tour industry in terms of universal distribution of products and services for, well, since the 1950s and 60s. So its goal, and this is all in that showcase site that I just mentioned, which is showcase.museumsintheweb.com, the goal that the Cooper Hewitt team articulated for themselves at the outset was a sort of an 85% take-up rate. And that they were taking from the Museum of Old and New Art in Tasmania and Hobart has an iPod Touch tour that everybody who comes in gets handed. And it's a very, very interesting experience and product that I have had a chance to go take in person, and I do encourage you, if you ever get to Tasmania, now there's not only the Museum of Old and New Art, very interesting, but also Janet Carding is now director of the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, so you'll definitely be seeing some fabulous stuff coming out of there, so good reason to go down under. Anyway, plug over. They have 85% of their visitors use what they call the O, the iPod Touch. And so that was kind of a goal set for the Cooper Hewitt team. And they're very good about kind of measuring and analysis and setting goals and things up front so they actually know whether they've succeeded or not. They knew from past studies that they'd only had about a 9% take-up rate for earlier apps, including the 2011 Van Cleef and Arpels iPad app, which is actually very good. In traditional audio tour terms, take-up rates, particularly for permanent collection tours, are very low usually, like 5% or under. Now, a temporary exhibition like Van Cleef and Arpels, to be honest, if it's marketed well, it's such a popular topic, people feel like, well, I've already paid $20 to see this show, what's another $5 to take the tour? I don't believe their iPad app was actually charged additionally, though. So it was a pretty low, a little bit of a disappointing take-up rate for what was actually a very good app. So when Cooper Hewitt's pen opened, the take-up rate was about 76% in the first 3 weeks after the March 10th opening. But as of the summer of this year, it had gone up to 97%. And Seb comments that really, you know, at the end of the day, this was not a technology project. The success or the technology was not the reason for that 97% usage rate. The success has come about because of staff on the floor. And so they did an awful lot in terms of working with staff on what they said and signage and things that were handed out to make sure that people knew how to use the pen and could use it successfully. So I took some of those numbers and compared them to some numbers both that Seb reported in his paper for the Museums in the Web conference last year from the Nature Plus project, which was at the Natural History Museum in London back in 2009-10. It used a similar RFID technology but on cards, so they were card readers. And then I compared it also to a study done by Silvia Filippini Fantoni. She's currently at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, but she used to work with me at Antenna Audio, and she did a really major study of the Tate Multimedia Tour, their second version of that tour. So 2005, you might remember, is pre-smartphone. These were tours that were handed out on, I think they were Dell Axims. I can't quite remember, but anyway, not nice devices compared to what we have now. What all three of these projects had in common was the ability for you to basically collect or save something from your visit and then revisit it online afterwards. So the Tate Multimedia Tour was taken by less than 5% of the visitors to Tate. We honestly didn't even track take-up rate because it was such a new technology and we had so few devices to hand out. That was kind of not even an issue back then. But what Sylvia did measure was how many people actually bookmarked, as we called it then, or collected, saved things to come back and revisit afterwards. And what they would do is basically push a collect button during the tour on the screen, and then when they'd come home, there'd be, if they had put their email address in, they would get an email with all the things that they had bookmarked and then links to find out more about those objects online. And in 2005, we had about 43% of people collecting, and then about 44% of those actually clicking the links and going back and visiting information online afterwards, so extending the life of the visit. So that's about 19% of the tour users. So we don't have the reuse rate for Nature Plus, but we know that they had about a 65% collecting or saving rate. And then at Cooper Hewitt, you've got 97% of people taking the pen, 80% of those people collecting both objects and things that they've designed. and then about 27% going back to visit online afterwards. So this might speak to your experience that you had of it not working when you got home. That might be driving down that usage rate. But where people are getting through, they're 8.4 page views, which if you're used to looking at web stats is very, very good. And about 20% of those people do end up creating an account. So they're actually putting in enough personal information that they can, then pursue a relationship with Cooper Hewitt from afar, if you wish. And the other interesting thing that was noted is that dwell time in the museum has increased dramatically from about 45 minutes to over 2 hours. Now, I don't think you can necessarily, and I don't think that anybody at Cooper Hewitt would want to say that's exclusively due to the pen, because the whole place has been completely redesigned. But it's interesting that that's kind of part of the mix.
The 97% is very skewed because there are many people there to help you.
Mm-hmm.
And they rush over to help you. It doesn't mean it works, they just try to help you.
Skewed in the sense of masking problems with the technology, is that what you mean?
Well, if you went to the Met, no one's going to rush over you and say, can I help you find, a Japanese kimono?
Right, well, I mean, absolutely. Making something universally usable is often something that just requires human intervention, and it's a big challenge.
Deal.
Yeah.
Great deal.
Yeah. So, I pointed out earlier in this just kind of web page about the Guggenheim Wikipedia event that there's this bookmark, this picture feature on the web page, and of course if you go to bookmark then you have to sign in, and hopefully they're trying to get you to sign up for their mailing list. And there are lots of examples of this kind of collecting around the web, and there have been for some time, with varying levels of accessibility and inclusivity in their design. In fact, if you look at Silvia Filippini Fantoni's work back from 2007, she also surveyed the Getty's My Collection kind of personal collecting feature. But the factors of success in personal collecting that she and others identified a decade ago still seem to hold true across platforms. And so that's exactly what really made me fascinated by the Pen Project, was if you go all the way back to pre-smartphone collecting on kiosks and iPacs, up through RFID cards and smartphone apps, and now the pen, you're finding that the same things contribute or detract from the success of the experience. So the interest or time that the user has in participating, the visibility of the surface, is it marketed, are there human promoters and helpers, the ease of use and understanding, including the terminology, and whether or not there's a kind of a natural or intuitive gesture. So I won't go into that one too much, but just to flag that there's also a study that's available online on the Smithsonian's Office of Policy and Analysis website, which is OPANDA, O-P-A-N-D-A, I think .si.edu, I think is the URL. And it's a study that was done in 2013 at the Air and Space Museum of how people use their smartphones. And they found that half of what people are doing with their phones in that museum is taking photos. And that seems to be pretty true across the board. So if you can come up with something that leverages that natural gesture, you're going to have a better adoption rate, because it's intuitive, people know how to do it. They're potentially even using tools they've used for a long time, like the cameras on their phones, rather than having to learn a new gadget. And what's really, the reason why I'm flagging these is because, of course, these are very easily mapped back onto those universal design principles, right? So, we're talking about flexibility in use, we're talking about visibility and the perceptive information, is this something that is communicating effectively to people regardless of the ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities? Is the use of the design easy to understand regardless of experience, knowledge, language skills, or current concentration level? Can it be used in a natural way with a minimum of fatigue? And is it appropriately sized and enough space around it for use? So really the point that I'm just trying to make is that if you employ the universal design principles to any product, you don't just get something that's more accessible, but you get something that is actually going to be a better experience for everybody, regardless of ability. And so this is just kind of doing what I just did verbally, this little chart, marking out where the factors of success line up with the universal design principles. Now, you'll notice, though, that I've kind of not ticked any boxes in the top line against equitable use. And I think that's the one that consistently is left out, even if we can get intuitive design, even if we can get, good marketing and visibility and promotion. The universal design principle that is most often skipped is this question of, is it useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities? But this is ultimately the key to being able to go universal, both in terms of inclusive design and connection with the broadest possible market, and that market being both mass market and niche audiences, and therefore is really the key to realizing the museum's mission. So if I were to summarize this talk in one phrase, it would be to assert that going universal means being equitable. It means taking on board from end to end the principles of universal design in order to create not just more inclusive experiences in museums, but better ones for everybody. And this is how I've moved from the idea of the distributed museum, where you encounter the museum on different platforms in different contexts according to their strengths, so that it's an experience that extends beyond the museum walls, to the idea of a pervasive museum inspired by subway stations turning into Wi-Fi hotspots. The idea that the museum really could be encountered anywhere as part of a network of access points that provide equitable use and enjoyment of the full breadth of the human creativity and ingenuity that museums are responsible for. And if that sounds like utopia, I could just conclude with a little treat. This is another crowdsourced project that I found very inspiring, the work of Eric Whitaker. Does anybody know this composer from LA? Okay, so this is Virtual Choir 4. Eric Whitaker crowdsources his performers for his original compositions through mainly Facebook, and then does some amazing technical wizardry to combine all of their voices. And let's see if I can get this going. Show you an example of what going universal looks like in his world. So over 8,000 videos, almost 6,000 singers from 101 countries participated in this piece called Fly to Paradise. Yes, so he records himself conducting the piece, and so they, from wherever they are, you saw probably a lot of people with headphones on.
And they have to visually record as well.
Yeah, and I think it's been a while, but when I saw a talk that Eric Whitaker gave on this, I think he was still rendering. After 3 days, they still hadn't finished rendering the video. If you can imagine, just the computing power it requires to put almost 9,000 videos into one animation.
And the audio, as well.
Yeah.
Is he performing the harmonies, or is he giving them the sheet music?
I believe he sends out the music and then he does the conducting. I haven't actually participated because I can't sing to save my life, but that's an interesting question. If you do look him up, I'm sure all that info's out there. And I know that his first one, which only had a few hundred singers participate, was all done through Facebook.
Yeah, they're all very young.
Yeah, but that's why I'm a bit confused why you would call that universal, because surely the analogy, like your verbal description, if it was really universal, would be allowing people who couldn't sing away. I'm not joking, because there's a tension between what you're defining as universal and a kind of big data sense of scale numbers.
Yes. And this is where I think the distinction between the universal design principles as a framework and a guideline and inclusive practice, which is an iterative one that is probably never going to achieve perfection, but is constantly striving towards that, is really helpful. And no, when I said that this is universal, I was punning on the fact that it's his universe.
Can I ask a question though? Do you see that these principles of universal design and inclusivity are feeding back into the traditional mission statements of museums? Because as you were speaking about the criteria for evaluating these projects, I was a bit struck by the fact that it's almost like you have the question after you have the answer. So you have the technology and its capacities, and then you evaluate its success at being able to be as accessible in the terms of the technology. And I wondered how that fits with the traditional mission statements of museums, or the ways in which museums imagine their publics in particular kinds of ways historically, if there's an intervening in that. In that, traditionally an art museum would talk about universal access, but they would be imagining that for sighted people, perhaps. They wouldn't necessarily be thinking about art for the unsighted.
That's exactly the point I'm trying to make, is that the mission of museums mandates accessibility, and it has for a very, very long time. Now, the first museums were created by wealthy individuals for their friends, and that wasn't perhaps part of it, but at least since the 19th century, that has been part of, I would argue, pretty much any museum's mission you look at in some way is speaking towards accessibility for all. But they don't, you're absolutely right, that's the problem. They're not thinking in terms of accessibility intellectually, physically, sensorially, cognitively. They're thinking, we're going to make sure that we publish widely, we get as many people into see our exhibitions as possible, we have the occasional free day. And really my challenge here is to museums is to take on board what's in your mission already, recognize that there's a lot of great work going on now in terms of practices that are trying to employ the universal design principles, and so you're not starting from nothing, nor operating in a vacuum, but that we need to connect with what the accessibility community's been doing for a long time and get better doing our jobs.
I think when looking at for universal design, we can't look at it as striving to create one entity that is universally accessible as one aspect, but creating an experience composed of multiple different tools that overall then create this universal. So the museum as itself is a universal design, having a universal experience. But you had mentioned with the spoken tool, the audio text audio tool, that you had slowed that down. And that actually it was jarring and quick for us as hearing, or as sighted people who it's not a tool we use on a day-to-day basis, but someone who this is part of their daily life at the normal speed, that wouldn't necessarily be jarring, and so putting our own perceptions of what feels comfortable, you can't look at that then for the different groups you're trying to represent. And so I guess it's for museum interactive or museum exhibition, it's just about applying multiple layers of tools that together as a whole group creates this universal experience.
I think you're exactly right. And that's kind of why I keep coming back to these metaphors of distributed platforms, of pervasive computing, because it's not about the building or a destination, much less about a temple on the hill. It's about, and it's in some ways it goes far beyond the physical artifacts in the collection as well, which necessarily exist in one point in time and space at any moment, and thinking about ways of providing access to them to people who may not be able to come to experience those in person in some way. Or, you know, as you raised earlier, thinking about experience of certain kinds of artifacts that might be film footage that frankly I don't want to stand in a gallery for 2 hours and watch, but I'd love to experience that from home or somewhere else, and that should be okay. And I think, you know, museums are getting there, but it's been a long, hard fight, and I think only very recently are we starting to see, you know, even the teams who work on the websites kind of coming out of a digital ghetto and starting to be considered an important part of the interpretive landscape and the accessibility landscape.
I think 3D printing will be, as it becomes more and more readily accessible, an interesting way to make objects available to experience through a multisensorial path. And I know something that's like, they're starting, it's still pretty expensive for the average museum to employ, but it's kind of
yeah, but there's been some really interesting experiments with that by museums too, you're right. I mean, the Met and Art Institute of Chicago, and yeah, I agree with you. I'm very keen on being able to make tactile objects. We only have 5 artworks at the BMA that people can touch. And we have, you know, but it was nice because we were able to make a little brochure. You know, this is totally analog, very cheap, very simple, but these are the 5 works, and you can go find them. And there is actually content about them in Go Mobile, which is our mobile web app. So you can even add, there's no verbal description yet, but you can even add something. And I think this is how we're going to have to iterate, is start by saying, okay, I can't do 3D printing, but I got 5 things that people can touch. And I can't afford to do a verbal description crowdsourcing project for them right now, but I can print up a piece of paper, and then maybe I can get a Braille version, you know, which actually doesn't cost that much. And then the next step, you just kind of keep building on it. So that's the inclusive design approach. Any other last thoughts or comments? Well, listen, I can't thank you all enough. This really exceeded my expectations in terms of the conversation and the great ideas and the questions and the challenges, and it's really, really helpful to my thinking and my work, and I really appreciate your going down this little journey with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.